Been meaning to do this video now for more than 5 months, but there you go, that's timing for you. But there's some things which have happened which makes me want to do this video now. I've actually already prepared another video that goes after this one, but that one I've actually scheduled it to play at a later date. This video is all about things that I've learned in my 11-12 years or so of astrophotography, the things which have helped propel me further ahead. Now this is not just normal, I suppose, compositional matters. So therefore, as landscape astrophotography, we are still thinking, of course, in terms of this is a landscape. We want to have some features in the landscape in terms of points of interest and its connection to the night sky. Now, all these videos which I do, all these stories which I will tell, they're all autobiographical. So they're always from my point of view. Now, I've placed this in 11 handy points. Why 11, you might say? It's because I just wrote down 11 points. Now, this particular video is probably best described as being sponsored by Skywatcher. The reasons which will become apparent later on in the video. Okay, now getting into my handy list. So number one is probably planning. Now, when I first started off photographing the Milky Way in terms of landscape astrophotography, I thought the Milky Way always rose at 2 o'clock in the morning. That was probably the limit of my knowledge in terms of astronomy and astrophotography. So I drove out into the countryside at 2 a.m. in the morning, pulled over by the side of the road and took a photo of a tree, which I lit with a speed light. And there you go, I had the Milky Way core in a photo. I quickly discovered that that's not the case, that the Milky Way core doesn't just rise at 2 o'clock every morning. And what happens nowadays is I actually use a number of apps, which certainly help me in terms of my planning. I actually write up and build a calendar every year, which shows the Milky Way core rise and set times, and also the moon phases. And I check this calendar to work out roughly, I emphasize on the word roughly, what my astrophotography plans will be. Because I could spend a lot more time on the calendar, because while it might show, say, the moon rise and set times, I also would like to know the position of the moon to the Milky Way core. So the apps that I use currently are PhotoPills, and I actually use PhotoPills to help me generate the calendar in the first place. A good thing with PhotoPills, apart from, I suppose, the planning which I do at this phase, is also with the augmented reality views. So I use it for things like showing where the Milky Way core or the moon or the sun will be at any point of time. And I also use Sky Safari. So Sky Safari is also quite useful because it will show me all the objects in the sky in relation to the Milky Way core or relation to other celestial objects. So if I want to photograph Andromeda with another object, or if there's a planetary alignment, then it will allow me to help see those. It will also show me where a comet might be at any particular time as well. So it has been quite useful. I also like Sky Safari because it allows me to pinch in and out the angle that you're looking at the screen at, which I use to compare with the focal length of my lens. So if I know that the field of view of my lens is, say, 90 degrees, then I can pinch and push out the app on Sky Safari to, say, 90 degrees, and it'll actually show where it is in comparison with the foreground. So this form of planning also helped me with the planning for shots like the crescent moon with the right luminosity below a setting Milky Way core, which basically earned me APODs, and also won international photography competition and things like that. Number two, arrive when it's still daytime and do your scouting. Now, I typically wander around with a handheld GPS, which is in the car at the moment, so otherwise I'd flash it up and hold it up in my hand at the moment. You want to scout before it gets dark, and with the help of apps like PhotoPills, this is where the Milky Way core or any other celestial object is going to be in relation to this foreground element. An example of this is, say, when I've gone out before and I've arrived at a location at night, for example, in sand dunes. And you can't see anything more than maybe a few meters ahead of you, even with the torchlights, and the visibility even with torchlights is not good. And you basically find a location to shoot from, you take a photograph and you go, okay, this looks fantastic. But if you actually arrive during the daytime and you actually use the apps and you say, okay, this is where the Milky Way core is going to be, you can actually work out a lot more of your elements and you've got a lot more depth to the image as well. It's basically arriving during the daytime, you can scout and then you can identify a composition that might be much better than what you might have missed, that might only even be just a few meters further away than the previous image. Okay, number 3, all the settings you receive and people advise you are all guidelines. Okay, initially people like to know, hey, where do I start? So typically when people give their settings, it's actually only as a starting point as say, look, this is an idea of what you should start off shooting. This is what I shoot. Again, it's autobiographical, so therefore that was just the right settings to use in that particular situation. Earlier on, we used to be focusing very much on the rule of 500. Or I always used to say the guideline of 500. I remember being approached by a photography magazine saying, hey, can you please write an article about the rule of 500? Well, I can write an article about the rule of 500, but I don't believe it, and I can explain why and what do we actually use in terms of determining how to shoot it instead. And then you've also got things like the NPF rule. If your sensor is larger in your camera, then if you zoom in, then you will start seeing some star trailing the longer you shoot. So therefore you need to shoot with an even shorter and shorter shutter speed. But it also comes down to things like where are you going to use it? So for example, if you're thinking primarily about social media usage with your photos, then arguably you could say, well, don't worry about it too much. I mean, just go for the guide of 500 as your guiding sort of shutter speed, or using an item that everyone knows I like, or using an alternative method. Even, I mean, you can even use a shutter speed of say a minute, even though you might be shooting at 35 millimeters, and you could actually end up with star trails, which you've got on purpose. There's nothing really that says that you can't do that. I think the largest print that I've ever had is probably about 4 meters wide. Well, hang on, I might have one even larger than that at the moment. But in the scheme of things, you know, unless you pixel peep really close up, is that you won't actually notice any of these little imperfections with the star trailing if you shoot for the, I suppose, a medium between the two in terms of a shutter speed. Now, talking a little bit more about the settings like ISOs and so on, when I started it was don't go above this ISO. Don't go above this setting or that setting. So I remember with my full frame camera, after flexing it a few times with the with ISO 1600, and which was basically what initially I was told that's what the ceiling is that you should actually shoot at. Then I was shooting at say. Then I decided one day to push the boundaries, and so I upped the ISO to 2000. Nowadays I'm shooting at much higher ISOs, so I might shoot at 6400, sometimes 12800, sometimes much higher than that as well. I think playing around with some video, I was doing video at 400,000 ISO. On a Sony a7S III, just testing and playing around with that. But the thing is that when you're out there, I mean, you can, to get the most out of a photo shoot when you're out there, play around with the settings a little bit. Take a few photos at one setting, change the settings, take a few shots at another setting, reduce the aperture a little bit, change the ISO, increase the ISO, reduce the shutter speed, increase the shutter. It's, unless you actually get out there all the time, is that it's best to get as much data in as possible. So next time you go out, you've gotten a better idea of what actually fits your particular shooting style. So you might say, hey, I'm perfectly fine shooting at 12,800 all the time. Or I might want to do, say, a star trail panorama, for example, or something along those lines. Just something completely different. Number 4, panoramas. Now, I love doing panoramas. I initially started by doing single images, but even when I went to using a full frame camera, I actually found that I was using a full frame camera initially with a crop sensor lens. So I was using the Canon 6D, which is a full frame camera with a crop sensor lens, which was the Tokina 11 to 16 millimeters. So knowing about lenses, you know that the edges of the lenses tend to be less sharp than the center of the lens. And also you tend to have, with some lenses, you might have small barrel distortion, or you might also have coma or other lens faults which are more evident on the edges of the lens. So because of this, I started doing panoramas, because I thought, well, if you're doing a panorama, then generally speaking, the center part of the lens is always what you're going to be using for the majority of the image, and then you can just crop out the sides. So ultimately, it's a larger image made out of a whole lot of the center of the lens. So my first panorama was a single row panorama, and I didn't use a panorama head or anything. I quite literally just used the ball head. I put it on the camera on the side, and I just took a series of photos next to each other. It was a little bit of a headache stitching it together, but I think even then Lightroom was perfectly fine in terms of stitching the image together. And I think my very first panorama image actually ended up in Australian Geographic. Now, talking about panoramas back then, there were some people saying to me, you can't do a panorama with an ultra-wide lens, which of course is completely false. It's just that it might look a little bit funnier initially, or there might be a little bit more work involved in terms of putting it together as a panorama. Now, when I went into multi-layer panoramas, so I went into a 2-layer panorama, then my next time that I did a 2-layer panorama, I actually won another competition, which is I won Astrofest. Now, another thing with the panoramas is basically the panorama selfies. Now, I initially started doing panorama selfies, just trying to remember the actual date that I did my first one. So my very first panorama selfie was actually up at the Pinnacles at Nambung National Park. And I originally wanted to do a shot that looked a bit like a teleporter shot, which I didn't do very well at, especially since I wanted to do it as a panorama. The problem was actually duplicating the light. And then I realized, hey, look, as a panorama, I'm actually only appearing in the photo once. So that's when I actually placed my light onto a light stand, and then I actually just replaced myself, so that the one image that had me holding the light was there. But then also you had all the other images which had consistent lighting, because the light was in the same spot every single time. Now, the next item, which is number 5, which is actually number 6 on my list here, but I want to come to number 5 later on. Number 5 in this instance is don't be afraid of the moon, and also don't be afraid of, I suppose, differing weather conditions. You don't need a perfectly clear night to do astrophotography. In fact, sometimes it's that I suppose the imperfection of the night sky, sometimes it's the imperfection, the addition of a more volatile element to the photo that really makes it something more interesting. So going back to things like my series of photos, that first photo that I did, which was a panorama, that was also not just a panorama test, that was also a test with moon luminosity. So that was probably about 60% moon luminosity. So that photo was with a test of a front lit moon lighting. So therefore the moon was behind me, probably about 60 degrees elevation. The next time I shot with the moon, I actually took a group of people with me to the pinnacles, and it was with the idea of side lighting. So I did a Milky Way panorama facing south, and what happened there was the moon then created shadows going on a side lit sort of way. It's a little bit funny because when you're doing the panorama, it's effectively 180 degrees. So therefore it had quite a wide field of view, but you can actually see where the shadows were being cast. I remember the feedback with that one, which was at a lower moon luminosity, because I was, again, testing the different moon brightness, and people were saying, and I got an amount of feedback saying, that's impossible that it's the moon. You can't photograph the Milky Way with the moon. But of course, the moon is a variable. The moon can be anywhere between a new moon to a full moon, so, and everything in between. So it might be 3% luminous, 30% luminous. It could be anything, basically. And what's more is that the moon, as it sets or rises, it's actually dimmer than what the normal luminosity will be for the night. Now, with this particular photo, which had the side lighting for the moon, it'd actually been raining that day. So the only reason why we went up to the pinnacles to do the photo shoot, apart from hoping with the moon conditions, was basically my older brother happened to be back in Perth for a couple of days, and he wanted to go out and photograph the night sky. So the clouds, there was still quite a lot of clouds around, and basically the clouds moved aside for just long enough for me to take one full panorama image, and then it got cloudy again. So talking about the moon again, the next opportunity I had, I can actually say took me 2 years to orchestrate, because what happened was I wanted the setting moon behind the pinnacles to create long shadows coming out from the pinnacles as the moon was setting. I think it was about 13% moon luminosity that night was forecast. Of course, it was probably a little bit dimmer because the moon was coming down, so it was a little bit lower on the horizon. So I wanted specifically the Milky Way core above it, and then the moon underneath it, and then the pinnacles. To be honest, I originally didn't plan on having the moon right on top of a pinnacle, but I got to a shot which I thought, okay, this could work, and I got the moon right on top of a pinnacle, and coincidentally I had the zodiacal light behind the pinnacle, which was right where the moon was. Now my next item, which I will say is number 6, but I've got it listed here as number 7, is actually slow down a little bit. Is you need to actually stop rushing around so much, unless you're on a specific deadline for features to be in particular spots, like a comet, for example. But you actually need to just slow down and actually appreciate the night sky. It's when you actually stop and feel that the epicness, I suppose, of the enormity of the night sky, that I feel that you can actually capture it much better. Now, the next item I'd like to talk about is around seeking feedback. Now, everyone on the internet, unfortunately, everyone has an opinion. So it's, I suppose, only really chase down feedback from people that you respect. So a couple of things with this, for example, is I actually sought feedback from my mother, for example. The reason why I respect my mother in terms of the art is that she's also an artist. So I actually said, hey, look, this is the image I've done, and she actually gave some feedback about the perspective. I fixed the perspective a little bit in terms of how you move things around with the panoramas, and then the photograph won an award. It's not all about awards, by the way. So another time, for example, I had a friend where we'd gone out to photograph the stars together, and next time we were in the car driving to another location, the topic of the previous shoot came up, and I asked her for her opinion of the photos that night, and she said, oh, the one with the bright light off in that direction. And of course the eye is attracted to the bright spots in the photograph. So that photograph was a star trail, and that light was just from one car headlights at that point of time. So therefore, just removing that frame or removing that one spot where there was actually a car headlight basically improved the photo quite substantially. My next item, now these items are not in any particular sequence. And to be honest, when I'm recording this, I'm actually probably going back to previous items and adding some additional embellishment to add to the recording so I can edit it together so it all makes sense. So the next item is actually learn as many techniques as possible, as you never know when you'll use them. So as an example, I shoot with a lot of lighting equipment, things like speed lights and so on, and that ultimately led me to use speed lights in terms of doing astrophotography. So there's quite a number of photography techniques that you can use, from doing portrait photography to landscape astrophotography or anything. So therefore, the more you know, the more you might be able to say, hey, I know how to fix this problem. This is what I'll do. Now the next one is actually around editing. There's a lot to be said about editing. Everyone's got different ways that they'll edit their astrophotography images, and that's up to anyone and everyone as to how they do it. And that's the great thing about photography, is that it comes down to an amount of artistic license. I see photos all the time which I go, okay, yeah, okay. Because you might have a particular sort of coloring which you might use more in a particular sort of style, which you've moved across to another style which you go, yeah, I'm not sure if that really works, but it doesn't really matter. It's not my, it doesn't matter what my opinion is to someone else's work, unless I'm actually paying them to do the work, or commissioning them somehow, or they're actually asking me for advice, or I'm running a competition which I'm judging it. It doesn't matter what I think, really. However, what actually has helped me in terms of the actual editing process is calibrating my monitor. Now, when I actually was entering things like Astrofest originally, the astrophotography competition in Western Australia, I think I was using a laptop. So again, with the competitions, as soon as I calibrated my monitor, all of a sudden the colors that I could see in my screen were a little bit closer to what most other people would see, especially if you put it into print form. So therefore, all of a sudden, it was my vision of what I actually wanted to photograph and produce was more like the end product. So you're editing and seeing what the end product will look like, as opposed to editing a photo and then printing it and going, oh, it's too warm now, or it's too dark, or it's too one thing or another. Is that the closer that you can get your visualization to the end product, the better. This next one is, I suppose, a little bit more personal in terms of how I like to do things. And it's actually moving, I suppose, while you could still say I love the flashy sorts of photos, not literally the flash, but the spectacular, epic sorts of photos, is that I'm actually really interested in photos with purpose. So I've been working on lots of projects over the years involving the night sky, and I really like knowing about things like the First Nations astronomy side of things, or I really like knowing what the importance of one thing or another is with the night sky, not just having an epic photo. So the item I was talking about before, which has kind of changed my numbering a little bit, is actually about tracking mounts. Now, I got my first tracking mount, which was a Skywatcher Star Adventurer, fairly early in the piece, and I didn't know how to use it. But once I did know how to use it, it certainly helped me quite substantially in terms of my astrophotography. So I'll definitely be putting that in as one of the items that's helped me accelerate how I've been doing astrophotography. Now, the reason being is that as I've done on a previous video, is that a tracking mount, basically, once you've set it up properly and know how to do it fairly quickly, and it basically tracks the rotation of the Earth. So all the stars won't move, but the Earth will move. But the advantage of this is that rule of 500, or the NPF rule, becomes a bit redundant. You can get tack sharp photos of the stars for longer exposures, and the further advantage is that you can use longer focal lengths. So I've been doing a lot of tracked panoramas. So I think the largest one I've got is about 180 images at 35 millimeters. Now, if you work on 35 millimeters with the rule of 500, then you can only really do each shot for maybe about 15 seconds or so. Brain's a little bit sore at the moment. Because I'm under some painkillers because I just had a tooth taken out. Now, if you were basically, so if you were only doing 15 seconds, then you only get so much light into the frame. But if you can do it for, say, 30 seconds, then you get twice as much light into the frame. And what's more is that it's very sharp. So always as astrophotographers, we're struggling to get more and more light into the image. So the tracking mounts really help with this. Now, my favorite tracking mount, of course, is the Skywatcher Star Adventurer, because it can hold about 5 kilos. You can turn on and off. It can be very useful for time-lapsing. So, and it's quite portable still. It's not that heavy in the scheme of things. It says me carrying 10 to 15 kilos around with me on some things. So what's happening with Skywatcher, and why this is actually considered as a sponsored post, is that they've actually got a promotion on at the moment. Is that if you look at this link here, it's about the Milky Way season has started. So the great thing about this time of year for us in the southern hemisphere especially, is that it's as soon as it gets dark, pretty much the whole Milky Way core is available, and it's also cooler weather. So therefore, with cooler weather, providing it's not clouded out, is that there's less liquid suspension in the air, which means that the skies are clearer. So generally speaking, it's a great time for us to be taking photos of the Milky Way. Now, this promotion is a social media sort of promotion with Skywatcher. There's a total of 7 Skywatcher Star Adventurer 2 photo packages available, and it's actually teamed up with about 7 different astrophotographers between Australia and New Zealand. And I think all you have to do is select one of the astrophotographers and then follow their social media pages for your chance to win. So if you're interested in winning a Skywatcher Star Adventurer photo kit, then just go to this link and enter the competition. Make sure you have a look at the terms and conditions, because if you don't follow the terms and conditions, you're not really in the running.